I want to welcome you to the Love First podcast this evening. And I want to thank Dr. Dietra for joining us this evening. We are going to talk about having dinner together. Now, I want you to think with me for a few moments about the most enjoyable dinner you've had recently or the least enjoyable. I want you to think about that dinner that when they called you about an hour in advance, you were hoping they were calling to cancel. We know what this means because we know that when we go to dinner with someone, it's different than grabbing a bite to eat. We know there's an investment, that we're going to have conversation. And no one understood that better than Jesus. He knew that over a table, the world could be transformed. So this evening, we're going to dip into our courageous conversation centered around the work that Dr. Dietra has been doing in these table conversations. If you are new to the Love First podcast, we are here to catalyze courageous conversations, to revolutionize the way we love. If you are returning, thank you for liking, subscribing, and sharing. And let's dive into this conversation.
Love first, I know. Love first, I know. Lord, take control. Lord, take control. Love first in my soul. Love first in my soul. Lord, take control. Lord, take control.
So, Dr. Dietra, thank you for joining us this evening. We're so thankful that you are here. And I would love for our listeners to get to know you a little bit. So would you mind telling us a little bit about your journey and how you got involved in seeing dinners as a way to transform communities?
First, just thank you for inviting me to be part of this conversation and for doing the work that you're doing to raise the importance of having this conversation and thinking about this from a spiritual place.
Yes.
I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, and I live here now in Georgia. A big part of how my journey here is growing up in a town called Whitehaven and going to school in Germantown, and knowing that there is really a divide. Also that, this was the community that Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in. That's where I grew up. And so in my own journey in this own family, I really have taken to heart that I had to be part of the change and that I had to learn how to have courageous conversations with people, and that I was called, really, I would say, to be a healing presence of God. That's been part of my own personal journey as a Black Catholic, in a community where there were only 3 Black Catholic churches for a while. And we learned how to come in and have conversations and talk about our faith in a way that was very joyful.
Yeah.
And I know in some places Catholics can be very stoic. So there's a whole other, kind of component to this. But a lot of what I've done has been related to that. And I loved how you said that, Jesus really understood the importance and the beauty of the breaking of the bread. Yes. And the sharing. And so for me, this is part of how I've come to be doing this work. And both as a clinical psychologist, as well as a community person trying to help heal our community.
Yes. I love that. I noticed that on your website, you mentioned Memphis and your love of dance. I love that. I thought everyone should know that Dr. Dietra also loves dance, right? Because we have a tendency, do we not, to look at someone and think, oh, well, that person is a PhD. That person holds a clinical faculty position at Yale University. And when we start hearing those things, we start boxing people in. And I just loved that note. Tell us, if you don't mind, tell us a little bit about the confluence of your formal educational journey as you were doing your dissertation, right? And these ideas were already emerging in you, and then how you kind of moved through that to take the clinical side and the academic side and bring it to the streets of Decatur. How did that happen?
So you're asking me to kind of condense 20 years of work, but I'll figure out like some ways to bring some of these pieces in.
Yes, and there's no timer on that.
Yes. So to start off with, I really found that people would find a way to talk with me and want to talk with me in random places in the park and such. So I felt like I had to find a way to be able to talk and work with people. But I also was really interested in what I call a Black rage, just a lot of anger in my own community, and wanted to find a way to help have conversations. I ended up in Chicago for my doctoral training. Yep. And in Chicago, got to be part of what's called the Human Relations Foundation, which is transitioned to the Jane Addams Hull House and some other places. But I was part of a research study looking at the racial tensions in the city of Chicago. And that led me to understand that they had to have a number of different things to address the racial tension in the city of Chicago. And one of those events was called the Chicago Dinners event. So I was looking for something to study that I could finish, and they were kind enough to work with me to do that. And so I got to talk with people and go actually participate in these events. And that really led me to understand that bringing people together, when I studied the dinners, I was expecting something really like phenomenal and, was looking at all these like factors and that sort of thing. And then really learned that the most important thing was people showing up, that this was strangers who were going to someone's home to have dinner in a part of town that maybe they wouldn't ordinarily go to. And that was really most important, is that people actually showed up, and that was courageous. And even now, 20 years later, it's probably the most compelling thing to think about. And so we've had opportunities in my work. I work with a number of different people in the recovery field, so people who have a mental health or substance use history that are doing better and are using their lived experience and their hope to inspire and support others. That hope and work has also informed my own work. Some of our dinners have taken place in recovery centers. We have had opportunities to talk about, it's more than just academics. So I like to tell people that if we could think our way through all of this, we already would have done it.
That's right.
But we have to feel, we have to connect. And many of us, through food, through music, through movement, which is part of where I came into almost everything. My own personal wellness has been in movement and dance and art. So I bring all of those components into how I understand healing needs to take place. And having people come together over food, or really just come together to have a conversation, because we've now moved to virtual platforms for these dinners. This is part of how I've been doing this work. So the Decatur Dinners was an amazing development that really took place over 9 months. So we had some kind of event every month. And that led up to that one night on August 25th, where over 1,200 people in very small, various places where I had 50 people at a restaurant, and all divided into small little groups, having a conversation and mixed with people who were interested. It was an amazing energy of people seeking a way to connect and to know that maybe their story wasn't the only story. And maybe there's a place that someone was willing to hear their story. So both, hearing another person's story and having someone really sit and be willing to hear yours is really, it's really powerful. And it's what I walk away with. I don't always remember people's names, but I remember the stories. And many of us are like that. We remember those stories.
Yes. And something that's really touched me about your work, your both and work, is there's this realization that, yes, there's a web that comes together, right, with your work because you're constantly collaborating. But that same web could be tracked out into communities where the recovery community can embrace these approaches and find great understanding and so on. And this particular thing in the Decatur dinners started with, if I remember right, some school teachers, or at least a school teacher, looking at some things in the school district and thinking, this can't be the best we can do. But the solution, like you said, if we could have thought our way through the solution, we'd have been done with it.
We'd be there.
The solution required something more. And of all things, addressing a school district and an educational issue required a dinner. And that really moved me. I also thought it was fascinating that the number of people that actually courageously showed up far exceeded the initial planning estimates. And I thought that was very exciting. We want to step just for a second, and I want us to think out loud about what we said in the beginning, because one of the things we see in the ministry of Jesus is that across these dinners, he's not just changing individual lives, but he's addressing systemic things.
So true.
It's always happening. It's not one or the other. It's touching this person's life, Zacchaeus, going to dinner at Zacchaeus' house, and then suddenly Zacchaeus is transformed in his taxation, What are some ways that you see dinners as a way to help people heal, but also to transform systems?
Well, one of the things I love about doing the dinners is that it's not a training. And because it's not a training, there's this experience of realizing that people can come together. I say this all the time. People can come together, use their forks to eat, and not hurt each other. And so, when I talk with people who come to dinners, I've had a woman recently at one of the dinners who at the very end of it said, I was just amazed that people could sit down and talk to each other, because in her family, people got food, watched TV. They didn't talk with each other and then really have that important conversation. If we can have that conversation in a regular way, that's not a training, then that means it can impact everything that we do.
Yes.
We might stop and say hello to our neighbor. Many of these events that I've done over years, people have come together and they'll be at a dinner table and they'll say, this is the first time I've been in my neighbor's home for dinner. Like I've said, we've greeted our children at the bus stop. We've done, things, we wave to each other, but actually coming into someone's home changes us in a very different kind of way. So I love that it's about an ordinary thing. It's not, it's not just school. So when you were talking about the Decatur dinners and how that came together, there were many different groups that were coming together, and everyone was starting to have this conversation about, we need to do something, and then we want to connect. So there were lots of groups that were having a training here, churches that were doing this here, the HUD community doing some things, and the school also doing some things. But it wasn't connected yet. And so this was a way in where police officers, with teachers, with parents, were all at a table together as people.
Yep.
Which is just such a different, space to be in. And then it helps you have stories, because now we're not just coming together, we're coming together and we're sharing our personal stories. We're not coming and sharing a definition. We're not coming and sharing facts. We're sharing our personal stories. And we know that, right? That's what changes us. So then when we're in our day-to-day, or maybe when we see someone on the street, we don't necessarily cross to the other side because we're willing to maybe give them a chance, like look them in the eye, maybe smile a little bit differently.
Yes. Yes. Something that a lot of people are afraid of is Man, what if we show up for dinner and then, we just stare at each other across the table, you know, but you did
Uh-huh.
some things to help navigate that and to get them
Yeah.
rolling, and some things most people would recognize, like you had a facilitator at each
Mhm.
table to help it get moving, and most people would be like, oh yeah, we know how to do that. But you did something so awesome with art, with
Yeah.
drama. Can you tell us about how the one act play came about
Sure.
and why that was so important to the success of these dinners?
Well, we have learned over the years that the dinners kind of have a particular flow.
Okay.
And we had an opportunity with Out of Hand Theater. Actually, I went to one of their events that they would do art in people's homes. And I was really moved by Minka Wilkes and the play that she did, Shaking in the Wind,
Yes.
with how beautiful it was in this very intimate setting, 20, 30 people in someone's living room watching this play. And afterwards, we all wanted to talk. Now, of course, I know how to help people have the conversation to talk. And so we saw this as a natural collaboration to bring the facilitation in, to bring a model that says, let's have a dinner party, and then to have the art of a very uniquely curated play that we all had a part actually in helping to develop. And because it couldn't be too long and it had to kind of be one person. And at the time for Decatur, we had to be able to have one actor be able to do this. And it had to be flexible enough. But really what's neat about having the play is that it allowed people to get to an emotional place first. And we've learned with either a play, sometimes we use a spoken word artist. And some of our dinners now that we're doing virtually start off with someone actually just performing a few musical pieces and then sharing a poem. And then that just helps us kind of get outside of our very intellectual parts of our brains and get to the heart place, because that's where change happens. Change for all of us is really when we feel it. We have to feel heard. We have to feel that we connect to someone else.
Yes.
It's not an intellectual thing. So we try to create a space for that. And that's why now, even without the food, it's still a very impactful experience.
Yes. And if I understood correctly, there was a person to perform the brief play at each meal, at each location, I mean.
Yes.
Right? That had to be amazing. And if I remember right, kind of the way that it concluded was the play is, I didn't know what to do, so I kind of came to dinner with you.
Yes.
Inviting people into that story, which of course allows people to evoke their own story. When you think about the 9 months leading up to it, how would you encourage other people? People are listening and they live all over the country and they're thinking, oh man, I want to do that. Okay, I can go to Dr. Dietra's website. I can go to Decatur's dinner, .org. I can do that. But how did it get rolling? So can you give us a little bit of an idea if you were doing this in another town right after the podcast and people were organizing? How would you what steps would you encourage them to take to get that moving?
Well, one of the first things that we encourage people to do is find a couple people who are interested and get on a call with us, because that's where we kind of get this growing. I've recently been working with a group in Cleveland, and we're pretty much at our 9-month marker as well. We've been meeting weekly for the last 6 months or so, and we've been having virtual dinners, and they've crafted it in their own kind of way. But basically, whatever community it is, it becomes your community and that dinner. And you just need a few people. The ideal dinner size is no more than 8 people. And you don't have to have 1,000. We want to encourage people to call and to say, hey, I'm interested. join and check out. There's a group here in Atlanta called Equitable Dinners. They've been doing a version of these as well virtually, and people can sign on. They're held every third Sunday.
And we've got one coming up, right?
Yes, there's one coming up very soon. And the Cleveland group is having theirs every second Sunday of the month. So those will be starting back up actually in February of 2021. So, definitely just look for places, reach out to us, talk to other people about it. We've got a few videos that help people get an idea of what it's like. You don't have to necessarily have a play, especially if your community resonates more with music or going to a museum together. There's all these virtual, wonderful museum visits that people can go on now,
That's
So
right.
there's a lot of different ways in which we can get connected. And the first thing I would just say, kind of connected to what I said before, is that it's really about showing up and making that commitment to go ahead and show up and ask the question. You don't have to have your most, staunch person who you want to convince to participate. You want to have the people who are kind of leaning forward. And that's what we found with the Decatur dinners and some of the others that we've done, is that we need to create an opportunity for people who are kind of listening, who are interested. And I think about ministry, and that this is a way of creating healing.
Yes.
And we don't have to get it all right, because I think what happens is people feel like they have to have it so perfect. And what's going to happen if somebody gets upset? What's going to happen if nobody talks? What's going to happen? And so what we try to say is, talk with us so we can help you. It's nice to have someone who kind of knows what to do and then just have a little bit of guidance along the way. Because there's some things to be mindful of, but it's not at all hard. If you've ever thrown a dinner party, you can do this.
You bet. I love that. So in your work, I'd like to expand this out a little bit, because in your work, you work with communities, but you also work with corporations and educational systems. And you mentioned recovery already. Yeah. How do you translate some of this conversational work into a business or into an institution, into a church? How do you kind of translate that into those moments?
Well, one of the things that we're kind of known for is being very intentional. So everything is by design, right? And because of my background as a psychologist, I tell people I don't necessarily do what I was trained to do, in the sense that we as psychologists have often been trained to listen to people, but also try to listen for what's not being said. And what I've learned in working with communities is I need to just listen and believe. And so when we're working with organizations to create policy, to think about recruitment, to think about retention, to think about how you work with your boards, there are questions and ways that we need to engage your end user at the very beginning. And so all of our work is really about asking critical questions and being really curious to listen deeply and to help the community or the organization or the leader listen a little bit more deeply to who they're actually trying to help. And that's part of our magic, is just having that exchange from the very beginning, being very intentional from the very beginning, and thinking about how we can be rooted in our why, and then talk about the things of like, how are we going to put it in place before we get into what's the money, what are the policies, how realistic is this? If we can build it off of a question that I ask, what's worked here? What's made a big difference, and what keeps people feeling hopeful? We have some guiding questions. Those in themselves very simply help us do amazing work with organizations that might be one or two people, the organizations of 10,000,
Yes. And I noticed that one of the things that people highlight from their experience with you is the astounding way that you use appreciative inquiry right from the jump, rather than coming in and helping someone further diagnose what's wrong with them. You help them build on the things that are good and possible and hopeful.
Yes.
But something else that I'm hearing in here, I'm hearing an echo of participatory research,
Yes.
right? That you are bringing the end user voice right up on the front end, which changes the conversation greatly. What led you to the place where you said, hey, if we can't hear the voices that are going to be impacted, why are we having this conversation? How did you move into that in your work?
Well, I started off as a researcher in health disparities and really learned a lot about what those disparities were. We knew a lot about who wasn't getting help and what was getting in the way and how easy it was for, let's say, a Black woman like myself to go to the doctor and say, this is what's going on with me. And the doctor really not to hear me and to say, well, as a Black person, you can handle pain better, all of these different things. Yeah. So we know a lot right now about what gets in the way. Yes. What I've learned is that if we only learn that, it doesn't get us to a solution. Yeah. And so I really made a commitment in my work to try and leave things better than I find them, right? To from the very beginning, and by just helping people ask a different question, helping people when I first meet them learn to listen to themselves and each other a little bit better, learn to tell a story, that in itself starts to shift. And it leaves people better than me giving them facts or, a tool. Because really, I don't know, I think in some ways we have to know that we have what we need inside of us. Yeah. Right? That we've been blessed and God has given us what we need. Yeah. And if we can stop and connect to those things, if we can connect to our better selves, then we really have what we need to move forward. But it's creating enough space to connect to that and to give someone else the space to do that too.
You have, you lean into the resilience, helping in community resilience and personal resilience. How do you, when you're doing this work, and maybe you can see the possibilities before others can, right? So you're kind of knowing good things are ahead, but people are losing their steam or they're facing frustration. What do you say to people who might, if they could butt into this conversation right now, they might say, Dr. Dietra, I love you, but I'm so frustrated and my community isn't like your community and I tried and it didn't work. What do you say to the person who really, really wants to make a difference and feels like that maybe they're hitting their head against the wall or they just feel defeated? How would you encourage that person?
Well, to begin with, I really want to just acknowledge and be grateful that they brought the question, and that they have shared that they're concerned and that they've been trying. I think that sometimes we don't thank people enough for being honest about how frustrated they are, and that they're willing to say it. How many people do you know nod and go, and then they don't come back?
Yep.
They don't tell you what they're really worried about. So I want to have people tell me first. And I thank people for that honesty. Sometimes in our trainings, we talk about compassionate listening. And a skill in compassionate listening is to thank people for their candidness, to really welcome that into the door. So that's one thing that I want to acknowledge to start off with. And the other is that we often have not taken a lot of time to focus and learn, have the story be told about, well, why was it that you tried that thing that you said you tried? What was it that was motivating you?
Yeah.
What's the story behind it? Why did you get into this work to begin with? Right? So all of us had a reason for showing up. So I can ask that question of a police officer. There is some story that it has some passion behind it for why you wanted to get into this to start off with, that you would risk your life for people, right? For a teacher in the same kind of way. So we can tap into that first.
Yes.
Then that helps me and will help them be able to have the resilience to push forward when you have the natural things that happen that get in our way.
Yeah. Now, when we think about the Decatur dinners now moving forward, in the podcast here, we're going to show a brief clip of those dinners. Nice. And our producer, Nolan, has done a phenomenal job with helping us on the podcast. But Nolan also worked with you in doing some video of the dinners. And so we're going to show a clip of that right now.
Well, it's something about food. When people are having food and they're sharing a meal, for some reason the walls come down.
Meals are synonymous for a lot of people with comfort. They're synonymous with family, love. And so I think that that's a good foundation for whatever is about to occur, and especially a conversation that could be as challenging as race, especially in this time and space that we live in right now.
The dinner table it's almost a sacred space, right? So when you gather with people, even if they're not people that you know intimately, and you gather around food, it is safer. If I'm dining with someone, it puts me in a much more receptive mood. And so what you've got is essentially these layers where this conversation can be given and received in a much more open format.
I'm a little bit on the nerd side, and I really like the brain. And I like to tell people that, the deeper parts of our brains have no words. So we have to have things that we do, not so much what we say. And so the more we sit and we eat, we see a performance that moves us. You sit across from someone and their story touches you. When you're able to move together, which is what happens when we sit and we nod and we look at each other, that's what makes change happen. It's the stories that we live by that actually make a difference in what we do every day.
Stories are powerful, so when we talk about something and we tell a story, You're trying to find something to connect to me and my story. If I give you statistics, you probably wouldn't remember. But if I tell you that one time I had stage 4 cancer and I only had 20% chance to live, which was actually so, then you would probably remember that the next time.
I think it's a brilliant question. That honestly is one of my personal frustrations. Nothing's gonna change tomorrow, 2 months, probably 2 years from now. What occurs is you do this, hopefully, you do this, and the sphere of the activity increases.
One of the last questions that was posed was, okay, where do we go from here? What can each of us do to tangibly affect change? And so that gave actionable items for people. And everything that we do is, it takes one person to do something and have that ripple down effect.
I think that people tend to assume that that an event like this is going to change the world into what we want it to be, and it's really just a part of the process of changing the world into what we want it to be. Like tomorrow, things will be better in the sense that connections will have been made, and people will know a little bit more about their neighbors and have more perspective on issues that matter. And so that's a good thing. And we need to be having a lot more of these types of conversations. And that's how things get better, is from doing the work that needs to be done. And this is the type of work that needs to be done.
If you change one person, 20 people, you don't impact anything. If you change 1,000 people in a city as small as Decatur, you might. You change 10,000 and you definitely do. So that's the aim for this, right? The aim is a very organic, word of mouth, one-to-one sort of outreach. It can be frustrating for people who are like, last year this happened, this is egregious, fix it. But what it can create is a community, or communities if it's multiplied, where people start to be more accepting of, more representative of the ideas and experiences of other people, which should lead to policy discussion, which should lead to executive differences. So it's a fingers crossed moment right now.
My work is actually about identifying what works and what helps people. And there's so much of a desire for people to move to a what, an action, without really understanding why and how. So for me, the dinners helped establish a connection to the why and then the how before we get to a what. The whats are helpful, which is usually policy, and policy needs to be informed by people's stories and lived experience. But how you do that is sitting down, going to where people are, and asking them and listening and truly believing what they say. And until we do that, we will always have policy that is out of step with where people really are.
So I have to ask you, I know you've watched that clip several times. What bubbles up out of you when you watch those beautiful people in conversation?
When I think about that night and listening to people, it just really fills my heart with a lot of joy and a lot of hope. And it reminds me of all the energy. I mean, that night it was buzzing. People were buzzing and just really having a great time. We had to get kicked out, like we were still there at the restaurant. They're like, okay, we're closing, okay, it's time to go. And one of the things, unfortunately, with COVID is we haven't been able to have the dinners in person. We're doing them virtually. But I tell people all the time, like, the dinner is supposed to be from 6 to 8. And I've never had a dinner that didn't go another couple of hours,
Yes.
where people kind of linger and talk and make a connection. And really, when I think about this, it tells us that we are designed to do that. Like, that's who we are. And you might not have all 8 people all sitting together. You connect with one other person, and then they'll follow that up, or they'll remember that person. I've had people I've met at a dinner 2 and 3 years later remember the story, or remember the performance that was done that night, and they keep coming back. So it's really just a beautiful thing. So I'm grateful that we had that opportunity and got to capture it on film.
Yeah. And you know what I thought of? This is what I thought of. Wouldn't it have been something if someone like Nolan had been around capturing those dinners with Jesus?
Oh, wow.
And what I would love for our listeners to do right now, because when we premiere this, we have a live chat that's going and people are contributing. I would love for our listeners to just put in the chat box right now which dinner they wish they had a video of, right?
Yeah.
Is it the prodigal son and the dinner of, coming home? Is it Zacchaeus? Is it the woman that the religious leader wanted to throw out and Jesus insisted that she be kept? I wonder how many of us, rather than, lining them up for a picture for the Last Supper, right? Maybe we'd like a video of the Last Supper and angles and moments and what silence felt like and what questions sounded like. Because I think maybe what would help us is to realize those dinners weren't perfect either. You had a guy over here that thought that woman shouldn't be here. And you had people questioning why Jesus would have dinner with Zacchaeus or with Matthew. You have an older brother that doesn't even like the fact that dad is having a big dinner for little brother.
Right. There's tension there. Right.
Yes. And can you speak to us a little bit about just the anticipation of normal tension when we have important conversations?
When I did my dissertation research, that was one of the most telling parts, was people sharing how they got to witness seeing someone be confronted or be challenged and still be able to stay at the table. And that was what was beautiful, to see the exchanges that people had, and someone saying, this is my story and this is how I've experienced that. I've been to dinners that were frustrating. I mean, I had one of my very first dinners that I ever went to, and a gentleman at the end of the table sat and said the entire time, "I just don't see it. I just don't see it." And but it led other people to connect with their neighbor, who was next to them, and to tell their stories and to witness and to eat. And that, sometimes you don't leave feeling happy. You might feel a little challenged. And that's why, again, I say it's about showing up. And I think about that in terms of showing up in our faith and showing up in our, it's more than just coming to church, right? And so the dinners are really another way to kind of live that out, of showing up and being a witness, that's such an important part of it.
Wow. I want to seize on that word, showing up and being a witness. You made me think about something in regard to what we refer to as the Eucharist, the Lord's Supper, the sharing and the blessing, these different ways that we express the taking in of the body and blood of the Lord, right? And I think about that being at the center of the whole idea of being followers of Christ. And yet, when we see one of the most famous examples of discussions in the New Testament, in the church, in the city of ancient Corinth, their dinner is in trouble. The way that they're taking the meal is in trouble. And yet, rather than abandoning the meal, right? The Apostle Paul calls them back to the table to reconfigure the meal in such a way that it brings about the blessing for which it was intended. And wow, when you said showing up, it might not feel good, but you tied it to our witness. That just struck me. That's powerful. What would you say to people who think they have nothing to offer at a dinner like that?
I think we all have something to offer. And some of the most powerful experiences I've had at these dinners are the people who have sat and just were intensely listening. And that it wasn't necessarily them sharing their story. We had a gentleman at a dinner recently who at the very end, that was what he hadn't spoken the whole time. And at the end, he said, I'm going to walk away from here and I'm going to have conversations with my kids. I'm going to be talking to them. We've had other people who said, I'm going to go and pay attention to what's happening at my kids' school. I'm going to ask some questions a little bit differently. I'm going to show up again. And that's been really powerful, like just to come again. One of the things that we are often challenged with is that as people of color, we've often had these conversations within sort of a cocoon in some ways. And it's very difficult to trust that you can sit with someone who might be different, that they're going to hear your story and not challenge it and kind of invalidate it. And it's one of the things that we try to work toward, and why we have a facilitated person there at the dinner to help with that, so that we can just say what I like to say with the dinner is that we're going to put some stuff on the table. And this is one of the chances that you get to not eat everything on your plate. Like, we're going to put stuff out there, and some of it is just going to stay.
That's right.
By anybody. Nobody's got
right.
their plate, And I think we have to invite people and say that come and participate at the level you're comfortable.
That's powerful. And giving people permission to show up right where they are, but to know that there are more opportunities coming, because as you mentioned, there are several of these things happening, right? And one of them is, if I remember right, this Sunday evening, November 15th, Equitable Dinners is having a virtual dinner conversation. This is from 5 to 7, and that these are actually planned through April of 2021. And so people can join in even this Sunday. They could just go online, register. Is that correct?
That's right.
Wow. And dive right in. So I want to encourage our listeners to say, hey, okay, now is your opportunity, right? And especially for those of you that would be just like nervous about going to a complete stranger's place, try it online. This could be your best next step, right?
It is really amazing that you can Zoom in. You'll be in a small room with another group of, 5 or 6 people. And what we're hearing from people is that it's a nice way to get involved from your own, living room chair.
Yeah, I love that. Well, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for joining us. We've been so excited about your work, and now we've connected with you, and we look forward to more connection in the future. Is there any last words that you'd like to share with our listeners just to encourage these courageous conversations?
I always encourage people to just stay curious and to know that it's really okay to sort of lean in. And thank you for listening. That even this is a gift.
Yes, it is. And I want to echo that. I want to say thank you for sharing. I want to say to our listeners, thank you for listening. Thank you for contributing. Thank you for engaging in these conversations. And like that friend that Dr. Dietra mentioned, you might be moving from this podcast right into a conversation that you want to demonstrate curiosity and the appreciation of listening. And you might want to share this podcast with someone and then say, hey, let's get a cup of coffee and let's talk about it. So thank you again for joining us for the Love First podcast. We ask you to like, share, and subscribe. And thank you again, Dr. Dietra, for joining us tonight.
Thank you so much.
Love first, I know. Love first.